All right, thank you everyone for coming. Tonight, we'll talk about Russia and Ukraine, and Rebecca McGory will be the presenter. First, I just want to let everybody know that my name is Tim Sheehan. I'm the director of the Pembroke Town Library. Our website is pembroke-nh.com/library. Please look us up and see what programs we're offering. I'm joined by Brittany Overton of the Hooksett Library. Check out their website. Their web address is hooksettlibrary.org. I do want to mention something that the Hooksett Library is offering that's related to this program. They have on display Home Family Motherland, artwork by Ukrainian students ages 5 to 16. Is on exhibit at the library, and it's courtesy of the Kharkiv Regional Library for Children. This exhibit will be at the library through the end of April, and is sponsored by the Fermanagh Arts Foundation Incorporated. All right, I'm going to introduce Rebecca McGory. Rebecca holds a master's in Russian politics and society from King's College in London. She also holds a master's in conflict analysis and resolution from George Mason University, and she has a master's in conflict resolution and Mediterranean security from the University of Malta. She has worked with BUR, a nonprofit in Ukraine that rebuilds houses for families and is partnered with schools to teach English at summer camps. Prior to that, she lived in St. Petersburg, Russia, while working on her master's degree. She is currently a program officer at the U.S. Committee for Refugee and Immigration, one of the 9 resettlement agencies for refugees in the U.S. Please welcome Rebecca McGory. I do want to say before Rebecca starts that we'll hold off on questions until after Rebecca's presentation. And please welcome Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so bear with me here. While I do that, I just want to let everybody know that I'm not here as a representative of USCRI, so all statements and opinions are my own. Let's see. All right, so the title of tonight's program, Ukraine and Russia, How We Got to Where We Are. So we're going to go through some of the history of the countries that are involved in the current conflict. We'll also do a conflict analysis, and we'll talk about some of the ramifications of it. First, I want to do a quick terminology. First is why Ukraine instead of the Ukraine. So the term the Ukraine is a remnant of the Soviet Union. Ukraine in its native language means the country or the borderland, and it was referred to during the Soviet era as a part of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine, rather than as an independent country. Ukraine without the is now correct, and it's understandably very sensitive for Ukrainians in order to avoid implying that Ukraine is still just a part of the Soviet Union or a part of Russia. The second is why Kyiv with a Y-I. This is the same city that a lot of people have probably seen spelled K-I-E-V and pronounced Kiev. So in Ukraine, there are 2 dominant languages, Ukrainian and Russian. In Eastern Ukraine, there are many people who only speak Russian, but across Ukraine as a whole, most people speak both. The Russian word for Kyiv, written in English, is K-I-E-V, Kiev. And the Ukrainian word written in English is Kyiv with the Y-I. So both are technically correct, but K-I-E-V is the Russian term for the city, and K-Y-I-V is the Ukrainian one. You'll see K-Y-I-V throughout my presentation. I just want you to know it's referring to the same city and why. So I'm going to start off with just some very quick facts about some of the older history between the countries of Russia and Ukraine. At the core of the debate about which country is real, something that's been discussed in the news a lot recently, is an empire that was called Kievan Rus. This existed between 879 and 1240, and it's claimed by Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia as the root of their society and their culture. Its capital for the first 3 years was Novgorod in what is now Russia. So if you look at that picture, you can see. And after that, for the remaining 355 years, the capital was Kiev. You can see down beneath Novgorod where Kiev is, and the white lines that you see represent country borders. Russia and Belarus, both of them took the RUS from Kievan Rus, and Kiev obviously was kept as the capital of Ukraine. Russian and Ukrainian languages diverged after the fall of Kievan Rus, and in the late 17th century, the Cossack Hetmanate rose. This was the equivalent of a Ukrainian nation state. It was then taken and divided between Russia and Poland, and then later by Russia alone. So just to give you a quick description of this map, you can see the area around Novgorod. This is a very small sliver of Russia that was included in Kievan Rus. Beneath that, you can see it actually takes up most of a country, and that country is Belarus. And then underneath that, about a quarter or so of Ukraine. We're going to fast forward a little bit to the 1900s, because this is where the history really becomes relevant to kind of the current conflict and the modern proceedings. So in 1917, inspired by the Russian Revolution, Central and Eastern Ukrainians broke away and formed the Ukrainian People's Republic after centuries of Russian rule, after the Cossack Hetmanate was taken over. It didn't last very long, because in 1922, the Ukrainian People's Republic was forcibly seized by the Russian army and annexed into the Soviet Union, which was then renamed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. From 1932 to 1933, there was a famine known as Holodomor. This is an incredibly significant event in Ukrainian history. It was caused by the Russian seizure of Ukrainian grain to feed Moscow and Leningrad, which would now be known as St. Petersburg. Between 3 and 10 million Ukrainians died. Most estimates say, around 7 million, but it's very difficult to estimate. One of the very important things to note here is that Ukraine is actually it has the most fertile ground in the world. So Ukraine was producing more grain than just about any other country in the world at that time. However, after growing it, it was seized and taken by train to the 2 big cities that were experiencing their own plights of starvation during a very harsh winter those 2 years. The result was that although Ukraine was growing plenty of food, Ukraine kept almost none of it, and 7 million was a massive portion of their population. In 1939, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the USSR. And so what is now Western Ukraine was annexed to the USSR as well. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence during the fall of the Soviet Union. And in 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine gave up all nuclear weaponry that it had in exchange for a guarantee of protection from invasion. So this is kind of the century preceding ours and the events that slowly led up to where we are. In 2004, we had the Orange Revolution. So this occurred when the Russian president Vladimir Putin assigned his personal election campaign to Viktor Yanukovych. He was a pro-Russian candidate running for president in Ukraine in that year's election. Yanukovych's campaign was based on reestablishing relations with Russia. His opponent, Viktor Yushchenko, was poisoned. It is very highly suspected, and all but proven that it was Yanukovych's campaign and or Russia directly that was responsible for poisoning him. However, miraculously, he survived despite extreme scarring, and he stayed in the race. Yanukovych won the election, but there was massive, very widespread fraud. This was similar in type and strategy to what we see in Russian presidential elections. So for example, observers weren't allowed in the back to see the ballots being counted, or we had counties whose total number of votes exceeded the number of people that lived there, for example. As a result, a massive protest erupted in Ukraine known as the Orange Revolution. The election was held again under close supervision by international authorities, and this time Viktor Yushchenko won by about 7%, which is a very significant margin. From 2013, the fall of 2013 to 2014, there was Euromaidan, or as it's known by most Ukrainians, the Revolution of Dignity. So this is where things get a little bit interesting in Ukrainian politics. After Yushchenko, who was the president that was elected in the second election, the legitimate election, he performed extremely poorly as president. And as a result, in the next election, Yanukovych was genuinely elected by non-fraudulent means. At the end of the fall of 2013, at the very last minute, Yanukovych backed out of a pre-existing agreement with the European Union for Ukraine to ascend to the EU. And instead, he signed a huge economic agreement with Putin. Once again, protests erupted in Ukraine and continued on and off through February of 2014. A private police force called the Berkut violently suppressed them, especially in Kyiv, with increasing severity. There were approximately 100 deaths, and 80-something of those deaths occurred exclusively between February 18th and February 20th, which was the most violent moment of the protest. However, the Ukrainian protesters succeeded. Yanukovych fled the country, went to Russia, and was promptly appointed mayor of a city by Putin. And that's going to bring us right up to what happened just before this year. So from 2014 to 2021, what we really saw was the fallout of the Orange Revolution and Euromaidan, and kind of the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. So immediately after Yanukovych is ousted, Vladimir Putin moved on Crimea. He sent Russian troops to cut it off from Ukraine and held what was likely a staged referendum. Obviously, it's very difficult to say whether or not it was staged without having been there, but the evidence strongly suggests it for several reasons. One of them is that because all of the Russian troops were there, most people who lived in Crimea were on house arrest at that time and wouldn't have been able to go out and vote. The second reason is that there have been several leaked videos of empty polling stations, whereas the Russian government reported that there were voting outcomes in the 90th percentile. The new Ukrainian government obviously was enraged, and in response, they outlawed Russian TV and radio and immediately began moving to eliminate Russian as a language on official documents and in schools. The problem with this is that Eastern Ukrainians, many of them, if not the vast majority of them, only speak Russian. So this was eliminating their access to the only language that they knew, and they erupted into protests of their own. Russia saw something of an opportunity in Eastern Ukraine and began providing weapons, training, and in some cases military support to separatist groups in Luhansk and Donetsk. This is known as the Donbass region. This was the official beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Something significant that I think that the news very often misses when they're talking about this is that this ongoing war effectively prevented Ukraine from ascending to the EU or to NATO, because engagement in an ongoing active conflict disqualifies a country from being a candidate. So by this conflict going unresolved for all of that time, Ukraine was unable to join NATO or the EU. The Minsk Protocol very briefly coordinated a ceasefire. It collapsed almost immediately by 2015. Minsk II was marginally more successful and most of the fighting stopped, but Russian support continued, and by most reports, Russian soldiers remained on the ground throughout all of this time in eastern Ukraine. Approximately 14,000 died in the war between 2014 and 2021, but the vast majority of those occurred in the first 2 years, so 2014 and 2015. So we're going to talk about the escalation now, but first I want to do just another quick terminology check. A security dilemma occurs when one country takes action to increase their security, and that makes another country feel insecure and do the same, which then leads to a back and forth style escalation. So an example of this is if one country felt insecure and immediately put, let's say, 6 nuclear weapons right along their border with another country. That other country would then feel threatened by the presence of those weapons, and they might put 7 nuclear weapons and 20,000 soldiers at their own border. This then makes the first country feel even more secure, and they respond by sending 50,000 and trying to strengthen their military alliance with another country. It leads to a massive escalation, I think, as we can see, and this is largely what happened between Russia and Ukraine. It's also significant to note here that Ukraine was utilized by NATO and the EU in the ongoing security dilemma between Russia and Europe. This escalated relations over a period of years. Interestingly, this did kind of operate to keep the Russian invasion of Ukraine at bay. So without this ongoing security dilemma, it's likely that Russia would have at least attempted to invade earlier. However, on the flip side, it also heightened Eastern European tensions consistently throughout that time and virtually guaranteed that this invasion would eventually happen. In 2020, Trump withheld arms from Ukraine unless Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, agreed to publicly investigate the Biden family. When Zelensky refused involvement, Ukrainian aid was cut, and this created a very narrow window because the Ukrainian military was quite a bit weaker than it was initially anticipated that it would be going into the year 2021. So during this time, Ukraine became increasingly more anxious and more desperate to join both the EU and NATO to ensure protection from Russia. And they slowly became more amiable to the idea, and rumors began floating around that they were going to make an exception to the ongoing conflict clause and allow Ukraine to enter. And that is what brings us to 2020. So afraid that Ukraine's ascension to NATO and the EU was imminent, Putin planned to frame Ukraine for a series of brutal acts in order to justify an immediate invasion. US intelligence was staying ahead of this and publicly outed Russia's plans, which is a very unique strategy that I haven't seen used before. And it did delay their invasion. However, on February 24th, Putin had more or less entirely lost patience. He abandoned the need for justification and invaded Ukraine with a plan to have seized Kyiv, assassinated Zelensky, who's in Kyiv, and assumed control over the Ukrainian government by the end of the second or third day. So on February 26th, Ukrainian President Zelensky informed his advisors that it is likely the last day they will see him alive as they prepare for a massive onslaught from Russian troops. This had a very interesting effect that I think a lot of people are studying right now. In saying this, however, choosing to remain behind, Ukrainian morale soared. And that, in combination with a few other factors that I'm going to get into towards the end of this presentation, really kind of shifted the tide. So on February 27th, Kyiv was still standing. Russia's planned overtake of it failed due to Ukrainian military defense tactic and also to supply chain problems for the Russian military. Once again, Ukrainian morale soars, and this time international aid begins pouring in as countries who had initially thought that Ukraine was more or less guaranteed to succumb realized that they stood a little bit more of a fighting chance and that it was a worthy investment, so to speak. On February 28th, the first round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine occurred. Obviously, a ceasefire was a big objective of this, but also it was an attempt, the first of many attempts, to negotiate a humanitarian corridor to evacuate citizens who are trapped in cities that are undergoing really significant shelling. On March 8th, the first and only successful so far humanitarian corridor was established, and it evacuated 3,500 citizens out of the city of Sumy. I'm going to discuss that here shortly as well. On March 18th, the number of refugees hit 3.3 million and the number of internally displaced hit 6.9 million. This number has since increased dramatically. I believe a couple of days ago, it hit 10 million internally displaced people who had been forced to leave their homes, but it's another very difficult number to judge. So I want to take a step back here and address a couple of questions. Number one, should we be skeptical? And number two, should we be horrified? A little bit of skepticism is healthy during any conflict. Not every single report will be true. Some will be intentionally false. Some will be accidentally false. However, in the case of Ukraine, the sheer number of news sources makes it a lot easier to find accurate information. So as opposed to previous conflicts of this size and this intensity in the past, where it was much more difficult for news stations to access what's going on the ground, and where there wasn't such a wide network of social media that could spread news so quickly, Ukraine is quite different because there is huge news access and the information moves very quickly. So there are a few things that we can pretty confidently state as a fact. Number one is that civilians and aid workers are in fact being targeted by Russian forces. Number two is that there have been thousands of Ukrainian civilian deaths and thousands of military deaths as well in the Ukrainian army. Number three, there have been more Russian soldier deaths than Ukrainian deaths. So very recently, this number came into question because of the city of Mariupol, which I'm also going to talk about here very shortly. In official numbers, number three is true. However, with each day that passes by, it becomes more and more likely that the death toll in Mariupol is going to kind of reverse it. Number four, Russian soldiers are in some cases intentionally sabotaging their own operations to avoid fighting. And number five, inside Russia, all reference to the war is currently punishable by prison time, up to 15 years for referring to it as a war instead of a special military operation. Fines are now in the thousands of dollars, and thousands of Russians are either being put on home detention or arrested for either showing support for Ukraine, protesting in the streets, or even something as simple, again, as referring to it as a war. We're going to look at some numbers here. So 3,300,000 refugees have fled Ukraine, mostly women and children. 1,100 missiles have been fired at Ukraine since February 24th. I know it's a little bit difficult to conceptualize what kind of number that is. 1,100 is a massive number. It is a huge number of missiles that have been fired in a very short time. There have been 3,000 plus civilian deaths. This plus is growing larger and larger, again, largely due to the city of Mariupol. And now we're going to talk about the countries that are involved, and then we're going to take a very close look at 6 cities within Ukraine that I think represent a really good look at the different circumstances that different areas of Ukraine are facing as a result of this war. So the first thing that I want to start off with on this map is we can see Russia, obviously, to the northeast and the east of Ukraine. Directly above Kiev, you'll see Belarus. Belarus was also a country in the Soviet Union. It's one of the three countries that claims Kiev and Rus as its core, as the start of its civilization. And Belarus has extremely close ties with Russia. It relies economically on Russia almost exclusively. And the president of Belarus was rather infamously elected recently in what appears to be very widespread fraud that again echoes Russian election strategies. And then if you go straight down underneath Belarus, you'll see Moldova. If you remember, I mentioned earlier about how engaging Ukraine in an ongoing conflict would prevent it from joining the EU. Moldova is in a very similar position. So Moldova was also a part of the Soviet Union, and there is a part of Moldova that borders Ukraine that is currently occupied by pro-Russian soldiers and citizens. It's what they call a frozen conflict because it's not really doing anything, but the conflict still exists. The area is called Transnistria, and once again, Moldova is unable to join the EU or even begin the process because of this active ongoing conflict with Russia. Next to that, we see Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. So these four countries are all members of the European Union. These are also four countries that are taking in massive numbers of Ukrainian refugees right now, the vast majority into Poland. We're gonna go ahead now and talk about the 6 cities. So the first one that I am going to start with is the city of Kyiv, right in the center there. Most of the city of Kyiv actually is still intact. Stores have run out or are running out of things like drinkable water because while supplies haven't been cut off entirely, they've been dramatically reduced, and a lot of the large roads around Kyiv have been either made unsafe by Russian forces, overtaken by Russian forces, or destroyed. Missiles have managed to hit several buildings, including residential buildings. Several other missiles have been deflected. One very important one that was deflected was one that was aimed at the riverbank outside of the city of Kyiv, where there is a huge amount of radioactive sediment underneath the topsoil of the riverbank from the fallout of Chernobyl. If this missile had hit its target, it would very likely have kicked up a radioactive cloud that would have behaved in a very similar way to the original cloud from Chernobyl. It would have had the potential to kind of float across Europe, causing massive radioactive damage. There do remain Russian infiltrators in the streets. So these were people who prior to the invasion were kind of placed in Kyiv to facilitate the entrance of Russian troops. There is still some fighting, therefore, even in the streets. Many people are still spending all night and all day in metro stations due to the constant air raid sirens. And although the Russian line of tanks, the convoy that was in the news quite a bit, has stalled, it's not very far outside of the city. I believe it's something like 9 miles outside. The reality of this situation is that absent a negotiated solution, Kyiv will eventually be under a much more active attack because it has taken so much longer than initially anticipated. They do have a couple of advantages now that it weren't anticipated in the very beginning. For example, the opportunity to prepare and strategically place their own soldiers and their own weaponry. The second city that I'm going to go to is Kharkiv. So if you follow Kyiv all the way over to the east, you can see Kharkiv is very close to the Russian border. So this is the second biggest city in Ukraine after Kyiv, and it's also where most of the pictures in the media that you've been seeing are coming from. Kharkiv is under more or less a nonstop onslaught from Russian missiles. There has been significant infrastructural damage, and despite repeated assurances by Russian forces, a humanitarian corridor has been impossible to establish yet, so many people remain trapped there. Kharkiv is strategically significant, both because it's such a massive city close to the Russian border and because it is the largest city of its type by far that is in such close proximity to eastern Ukraine. So almost everything to the east of Kharkiv is what we're talking about when we talk about the war in the east, when we are talking about the Donbass region, Donetsk, Luhansk. So for these reasons, Kharkiv is a very important city for them. It also has a very large international airport. As of right now, Russians have not taken the city, though they've claimed it a few times. However, they are fighting very hard for it, and their current strategy could be considered similar to the infamous Russian scorched earth policy. Either it will be theirs or it will be unusable. And that's why and how internally they're justifying such vicious use of missiles and other weapons against the city. Next, I'm going to go all the way to the west, the city of Lviv. Lviv is very close to the Polish border, and it is currently acting as a hub for a huge number of internally displaced people fleeing their cities. So there are a lot of people that are unwilling to leave Ukraine. They may be forced to flee their cities, or they may leave their cities willingly because they don't feel safe there. But many of them don't want to leave their country. And so a lot of them end up in Lviv or in the surrounding areas of Lviv. This is also a hub for refugees who are trying to leave the country because they can then take a bus from Lviv into Poland or any of the other countries, but Poland is by far the most popular. Because Lviv is so far in the west and so close to the border of an EU country, Poland, it has been largely unhit. That was until Russia began to kind of amp up their attacks in the west. It's still nothing compared to what's going on in central and eastern Ukraine, but there was a military outpost, for example, that was one that was pretty big in the news, and it resulted in 35 deaths. Next, I'm going to go to the southmost city that I have marked here. This is the city of Kherson. This is a smaller city of less than 3,000 people. This is strategically important because it's a port city. It's receiving a lot of attention in Ukraine right now, even though it hasn't really been mentioned very much in Western news. So we don't see anything about Kherson in our own news. But the reason that it's famous in Ukraine is for very brave and very spirited citizens. An example of this was due to lack of weaponry when Russian soldiers and Russian tanks began rolling into the cities. Kherson residents were throwing their bicycles at them and then eventually knelt in the streets in front of Russian tanks to stop them from moving forward. They have also continued to stage massive parades, pro-Ukrainian parades. So there are pictures going all around Ukrainian social media right now of citizens of Kherson with massive Ukrainian flags marching around these Russian tanks, stalling them or even using them as part of their demonstration. And another one that has been making its way around is a picture and story of several farmers of Kherson who have decided to go out and work in the field regardless of the ongoing conflict. So pictures of them heading to the road in their tractors, for example, to work the ground has been making its way around. About a week ago, the Kremlin did claim that Russia had taken control of Kherson. They had claimed this several times before, but at this point, it's not very clear. It hasn't been confirmed even now. What's going on more likely is that Russia has huge control over the majority of the city. However, Ukrainian resistance continues. So it would be not quite correct to say that Russia has taken the city, which would imply that Russia now maintains complete control and has more or less annexed it, even in the sense of like a conflict zone. All right, so the second to last one is Mariupol. If you follow Kherson over to the east, you can see Mariupol, which is where the vast majority of the casualties currently are. So I mentioned there were 3,000 plus casualties. 2,500 of those were from Mariupol alone. And this is a very moderate guess. So 2,500 have been confirmed, but at this point it is impossible for authorities in Mariupol to determine how many have actually died. Mariupol is a strategic holdout because it is one of the largest cities in Donetsk and in the Donbass region as a whole. Russian forces are attacking Mariupol more or less indiscriminately. And prior to the number 2,500 was prior to the bombing of the theater that occurred about, I think, 5 or 6 days ago now. It was suspected that there were 1,300 women and children trapped underneath the rubble of that theater. They were unable to be rescued because of the onslaught of missiles, and so they are now presumed to have died. And several days ago, there was also the bombing of a theater, or I'm sorry, of a school, where it was anticipated that approximately 400 people were underneath that debris. I believe they haven't been declared presumed dead yet. However, if it remains impossible to get to any of them, those who are unable to escape from underneath the rubble on their own will also perish. So far, the mayor of Mariupol has estimated that the actual death number could be as many as 20,000 in this city alone. It's been nearly 2 weeks now that Mariupol has run completely out of food and water. So some of the deaths that are occurring are due to dehydration at this point. There is no electricity, no running water. Red Cross attempts to bring aid into the city have mostly been attacked. At one point, the Red Cross outpost was blown up by a Russian missile, which led the Red Cross to abandon the mission. And despite initial success in the very beginning of a few people who were able to get out, and since then, to be fair, there have been several thousand who have just, for lack of a better word, chanced it and privately evacuated on their own. Mariupol is still the city that is in most desperate need of evacuation right now. Once again, repeated negotiations to establish a humanitarian corridor have mostly failed. It does seem, at least right now for the last 2 or 3 days or so, like Russia is easing up the missile attacks on the surrounding roads, which is why so many have been able to privately evacuate. But in official terms, no humanitarian corridor exists. The last city is Sumy, so that's the northmost city on this map here. Sumy is very close to the Russian border as well, and it's another incredibly hard-hit city right now. So the term oblast is like the equivalent of a state in Ukraine, and most of the oblasts, the states, are named after like their capital city. So Sumy is the name of the oblast, and it's also the name of the city. And most of what I'm saying applies to the entire oblast, not just to the city. So it was among the first city and region to be completely cut off by Russian forces from the rest of Ukraine. This includes a small nearby city called Konotop, which is one of the cities that I worked in. And although Sumy was able to evacuate some residents early on, that was the 3,500. Since then, most residents of Sumy, Konotop, and other surrounding cities have remained trapped. There have been reports, eyewitness accounts, and in some cases, even videos showing civilians attempting to escape by car, including with children. So people filling a car with children, for example, to try to evacuate them, and the entire car being blown up by Russian tanks. So most citizens remain stuck in bomb shelters, very afraid, and the vast majority of them are too scared to attempt evacuation except on foot. There has been some success for people who have left on foot, but that carries its own risks, especially in winter in northern Ukraine. So this has just been kind of a breakdown of some of the cities in Ukraine and the ways that the war looks very different in different areas right now. So a question that I think has been on a lot of minds, and it's certainly been a lot of fodder for debate in the news, is why wasn't it easy for Russia to take over Ukraine as it had planned and as the world kind of anticipated? And the truth is that there's a few reasons for that. So the first one I would say is that Russian soldiers actually weren't told that they were invading until just before the invasion began. So the same explanation that the Russian government gave to the rest of the world, that the soldiers who were stationed near the border were only there to do practice drills, was the explanation that was given to the soldiers themselves as well. Therefore, they were very ill prepared, very frightened, and a huge portion of them were between the ages of 18 and 22. So these are very, very young, inexperienced soldiers that did not anticipate or prepare themselves to enter war, and who were kind of very abruptly shipped across the border. The second one is that the Ukrainian government did have time to prepare, and Ukrainian morale is very high and kind of rising higher, honestly, in a lot of ways. Soldiers in Ukraine are exceptionally motivated, and aiding this is the fact that the President Zelensky multiple times a day addresses everybody on Facebook, for example, and on Telegram, which is a very popular messaging app that they use in Ukraine. Ukrainian soldiers offer food and housing to Russians who defect, and some EU countries have begun offering amnesty and asylum to Russian soldiers who refuse to fight. Ukrainians began destroying and removing road signs, which left Russians unable to navigate to their destinations. This is actually a very interesting tactic that they used. Ukrainian roads are notorious for being extremely difficult to navigate, and I can testify to that personally. It's very difficult. Ukrainians have a very intuitive and kind of innate sense of their land, especially because many Ukrainian cities and towns are almost similar in nature to villages, in the sense that it will be a collection of houses, but there won't be any like real hospital or doctor's office there, for example, or restaurants or stores. So they'll have to leave and go down these incredibly complex winding roads in order to get anywhere. Because of this, Ukrainians know their way around very, very well, but it's extremely difficult to navigate if you can't figure out where you're going, hence removing the road signs. Another issue is that there were massive issues with Russian supply chains. Fuel refills were getting lost or never arriving, and so Russian soldiers began sabotaging their own supply chains, up to and including stabbing holes, for example, in their own fuel tanks, so that the tanks would run out and they would not be able to move forward. This is actually very strongly suspected to be one of the reasons that the convoy outside of Kyiv stalled, because in addition to the supply chain being broken and fuel not really arriving to replenish it, the tanks themselves were being sabotaged to avoid fighting, in other words. Another one is that the world did not expect Ukraine to last beyond the first couple of days. Once those days passed, the world began pouring aid into Ukraine, which is in a lot of ways sustaining the Ukrainian military and again, driving morale very high. It's important, I think, to note here that when people are weighing who has a stronger chance, for example, what they very often do is they start comparing the number of weapons. So, Russia has this many weapons and this many soldiers, and Ukraine only has this many weapons and this many soldiers. However, it's actually been a very long time since the number of weapons has genuinely been relevant to a war. If that were the case, and if, for example, more advanced technology and better weaponry were genuinely a massive factor, I think that there would have been very different circumstances surrounding the Vietnam War, the Korean War, for example, and even more recently, Syria and Afghanistan. So these are all scenarios where it was kind of anticipated that it would be an easy overtake, because the people who were getting involved, the United States generally, had so much more advanced weaponry. In reality, it really does come down to who has kind of the home advantage. It also comes down to the morale and motivation of each side. And in this case, there's really no comparing the motivation of Russian soldiers versus the motivation of Ukrainian soldiers. The last one is that Ukraine has an extremely large and very involved international diaspora that has also poured funding, medical support, and military support into Ukraine. So this has also made a pretty significant difference. So now we're going to talk about the ramifications and consequences. We'll start with Ukraine. Thousands have died and thousands more are likely to die, including civilians, aid workers, and soldiers. Infrastructure repair costs will be in the billions at the very least, likely significantly more. There are some families who have been separated who are unlikely to be reunited, even if the war were to end tomorrow. If Russia does take Kyiv, the death of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is extremely likely. He would be replaced by a Russian selected leader, and this is significant for obviously a whole bunch of different reasons, but one that I think hasn't really been considered by mainstream media and by a lot of analysts is that this would change the dynamic of the war into what would be closer to a civil war, in which the Ukrainian army or parts of the Ukrainian army were now fighting against what they recognize as an illegitimate leader who was backed by Russian resources. This would also impact the amount of aid and military support that the international community could give to Ukraine, because most international players in what's going on right now have really quite strict limits, we could say, on how much interference and aid they're allowed to provide to a country that is engaged in a civil war. And a lot of them have policies that prevent them from choosing a side. So not only would it be, obvious to replace the Ukrainian president with one that Putin preferred, it would also potentially, depending on how the international community recognized it, change it to an internal war that a lot of countries felt like they could no longer touch. Ukraine has so far lost nearly 7% of its population through fleeing refugees. This number is rapidly going up. Many in Donetsk and Luhansk do identify as Ukrainian. In the event that the war ends with Donetsk and Luhansk being seized by Russia, there would be a second flow of refugees. So these would be people that did not want to give up their Ukrainian passport in favor of a Russian one. And so they would also flee west. I do want to say that I don't think that this is a particularly likely outcome. However, it is one of the things that is being brought up in the negotiations between the two sides right now, the possibility of allowing Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea to remain Russian territory or Russian influenced republics. In Ukraine, on the flip side, there's a very common saying going around right now: everything will be Ukraine. So Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea will all remain Ukrainian by the end of the war. That's one of the dominant mottos that are going around. As Russia becomes increasingly desperate, the ferocity of attacks will increase. Russia went from what looked like an assured victory in their mind to what now looks like a likely loss if it follows its current trajectory. The use of chemical weaponry, nuclear reactor sites, and framing Ukrainian soldiers to justify Russian attacks are all potentially imminent. So I want to highlight a couple of these things here. The use of chemical weaponry in particular, there's something that's known as a false flag that is very, very common as a Russian strategy. This is when any country, in this case Russia, accuses the other side of doing something that they are planning on doing. So throughout all of recent history, Russia has engaged in these false flags and very recently accused Ukraine of utilizing chemical weaponry and bioweapons, which very strongly implies, sorry, somebody just knocked on my door. It very strongly implies that they're planning on doing so in the near future. Of course, it could also just be kind of a threat, but I do think that this is on the table. When I say nuclear reactor sites, so far, Russia has successfully targeted, although explosions have been prevented, 3 nuclear reactor sites from within Ukraine. One of them is the largest nuclear reactor site in all of Europe. What this would allow, if Russia were able to successfully set one off, would be the equivalent of a nuclear disaster without having to take credit for having dropped any type of nuclear weapon. So this is something of a workaround that I think the attacks thus far have largely been predatory and threatening in nature. However, it is a very real possibility, and it's one of the reasons that Europe is so panicked right now about these nuclear reactor sites. Moving on, we're going to talk about the consequences for Russia. Although Putin has utilized mass fraud in elections, it was also true that in every election thus far, he received a genuine majority of votes. So the fraud that he was utilizing wasn't to turn the election in his favor, but rather to increase the margin by which it looked like he won. So instead of him admitting that he won 57% of the votes, for example, he would utilize fraud to add an additional 12% onto that and claim that he had actually won 69% of the votes. Now his popularity is sharply decreasing among those who have access to information about Ukraine, but it's definitely increasing among his supporters and also those who don't have access to information about what's going on in Ukraine. The people who don't have access, there's several reasons for this. Number one, Russia has banned several common social media websites in the West and in Ukraine. One of them is Facebook, also Instagram, Twitter. Instead, Russia has what's called Vkontakte, which is like a Russian version of Facebook. However, because it is state controlled, like all other Russian media, they have the ability to entirely control what news is being released. And the narrative that Russia is currently releasing by news is that this is like a resurgence of World War II, and that Russia is going into Ukraine to fight off Nazis in defense of Russians and Ukrainians, very similar to what happened in World War II. So you can see how there's a very steep divide between people, largely the younger population who use VPNs, virtual private networks, to be able to access some of these banned sites and who are actually able to see some of the actual pictures, for example, of what's going on in Ukraine, and especially those who support Putin and therefore don't want to believe it, and those who simply don't have access to any information outside of what they're given through the news. Sanctions and bank cutoffs have crippled the Russian economy, but unfortunately, this doesn't really impact Russian military capability. There is still a lot of money in Russia. Putin is estimated to be the richest man in the world, and a lot of the oligarchs in Russia are, in fact, just kind of pockets for his personal money. So although there is all of this money in Russia, it's not in the hands of most Russians, many of whom are now in dire economic situations. These sanctions are a strategy to encourage Russians to rebel against Putin internally. I'm going to expand on that a little bit. In reality, the Russian military is already very well equipped. If they wanted to continue the war on for the next few years using only what they have and what Putin's personal fortune is able to buy, they wouldn't have really any problem with that. The sanctions, therefore, don't impact Putin's ability to wage the war, and not by any realistic or measurable standard. What they do, however, is first redivert attention from the Russian government, because obviously there are very significant and very difficult situations that Russians are facing on the ground. And it also encourages Russians to rise up and take care of the government internally, more or less. This is understandably a very controversial strategy, but that's the current dynamic that is happening when you see them talking about sanctions and such in the news and in interviews. Many who have passports are fleeing Russia. Many others in the thousands are protesting and being arrested or detained inside their home. Under increasingly desperate conditions, Putin is beginning to behave increasingly more erratically and will continue to do so. One of the ways that we can see this is that Putin is very famous for, in interviews, in discussions, in media announcements, being very cold, very calm, very calculated. However, recently we've been seeing him become increasingly more emotional. And the justifications and reasons that he's been giving in the news have also become increasingly less logical. So this indicates definitely a turning point for him in terms of his mental state right now, his psychology, but it also tells us quite a bit about what we can expect from him, in the sense that it makes him even more unpredictable. This does mean, so there are a few predictions we can make. It means more punishments for Russians. We may see that jail term go up, even from 15 years to higher, may see fines go up. It means more severe attacks on Ukraine. It also means threats to the international community, which he may or may not follow through with. So the catastrophic consequences that he's talked about recently are both threats to kind of discourage involvement, and potentially may lead him to actually take drastic action, if only to first reinforce what he's saying, and second, kind of keep his status as I guess we could say like the king of chicken. Putin has historically been the single most effective politician when it comes to that as a strategy. So he threatens to do something and leaves other countries in a bit of a bind and unable to do anything about it without risking him following through on these threats. So he's going to continue utilizing this strategy. Whether or not the dynamic changes, I think, will depend partially on what he has access to internally, but it's also going to depend on where he sees this war going in his kind of evolving understanding of it. I'm going to move on to consequences for Europe and the US. So Poland is currently taking in the vast majority of all refugees. It's about 1.8 million out of the 3 to 3.3 million so far. Many of these are then traveling to other locations. However, it's still a huge number that is going into and through Poland. In the event that the war does not end quickly, a structure will very likely be put in place to divide refugees up among other European countries, the US and Canada. They're undoubtedly going to wait for that, at least right now, in part because since negotiations are ongoing, there still seems to be some political hope that this conflict will end sometime in the near future, and it would be a lot more difficult to move refugees out by the millions, or at least hundreds of thousands, to other countries and then send them back, 2 or 3 months down the line. So that's why there hasn't been anything significant. There probably will be, minor announcements made by the Biden administration moving forward. However, generally speaking, it will probably either be a little bit of time or a massive event before any proper protocol is announced for Ukrainian refugees. European and NATO involvement is not impossible if Russia were to target a convoy, whether intentionally or unintentionally, fire a missile into EU territory, or use significant chemical or nuclear weaponry. But absent these conditions, and possibly even under these conditions, they are likely to continue to refuse to engage. European and US economies will also continue to be damaged due to fractured economic relations with Russia and Belarus, and potentially China. However, gas and oil prices will stabilize likely in the next 2 to 7 weeks based on factors independent of the war. So it is very, very common in a wartime economy for the price of oil and gas to skyrocket, even if it doesn't involve a country that produces or exports oil. This is just kind of a factor of wartime economy that oil tycoons take advantage of. Since the word oil is currently being thrown around pretty much daily because Russia was a country that we had oil relations with, it is doing it even more so. The result of this is that even though the price of oil is currently going down, gas prices aren't really decreasing. And what we will very likely see is that in those 2 to 7 weeks, gas will slowly decrease and eventually stabilize at a new normal that will probably be higher than the previous normal, even if the price of oil is actually lower than it was before. So how do we help? There are a few ways. So number one is to donate. Razum for Ukraine is at the forefront of American efforts to provide humanitarian aid to Ukrainians on the ground. They are a long established and trusted organization with partners in Ukraine. I've worked with them personally in the past. Number two is to remember to treat Russians and Ukrainians kindly. The Ukrainian diaspora in the US is suffering massive trauma. Reach out to your community to ask if you can help, but do not ostracize or harm Russian people, many of whom are also scared and entirely unrelated to what the president of a country that they long left behind or maybe even never lived in is doing. Another important point here is that this would also give Russia a foothold to insist that they must protect their own against aggression. So if Russians begin seeing violent crime, for example, and discrimination internationally because of the actions that Putin is taking, it then becomes a further justification for Putin to insist that Russia is under attack and that actions must be taken to protect Russians from the international community. The third one is to calmly talk about it, to spread what you know, talk about it with your friends, talk about it with your families. If you're a teacher, talk about it with your students. Use trusted news sources and don't allow your personal fear to dictate your morals or your opinions. It becomes very common, and I think it's quite human nature in kind of scary times like these to begin saying things like, well, there's nothing we can do without risking World War III. So we just need to stay out of it, leave them to it, for example. This not only obviously ostracizes and alienates Ukrainians, but it also can have the impact of impacting what would otherwise be really sound diplomatic decisions. So there are people who are making decisions about the conflict as it goes on. However, as we know, social pressure can very much contribute to political decisions. Historically, decisions that have been made due to pressure driven by fear have not been nearly as politically and diplomatically sound as decisions that are made by diplomats and by politicians who have a calmer and steadier backing from the people who live in the countries that they're representing. All right, I'm going to go ahead and open it up now for Q&A. You're welcome to type them in the chat if you have a hard time typing, or if you don't have access to the chat, you could also use your mic or use the hand raise function. We'll do them one at a time, so you might not be called on right away. I just want you to know that if you don't have access to be able to type, you can still ask questions. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now so that we can get started with that.
Rebecca, we did have a couple questions in the chat that came in directly to me. One of them is asking if you could please clarify when you were speaking about one of the communities, I believe in the southern part of Ukraine, community members throwing bicycles in front of tanks. And after that, it sounded like you may have said melting, or was it kneeling?
Kneeling. So Ukrainian citizens were kneeling on the streets in front of tanks to prevent them from moving forward.
And then one other question really quick. Is there a definitive as to what Russians intend for Ukrainians? Assimilation, genocide, concentration camps, extermination?
That's a very good and very challenging question. I think when it comes to stuff like this, there is never an absolute definitive. However, I can give you my best guess based on political analysis and historically what has happened. Putin does not want to see Ukraine wiped off the face of the planet because in Putin's mind, this is something that he said before even, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the single greatest tragedy of modern times. What he would like to do is kind of reestablish it with Ukraine and Belarus as the first ones. There's actually a very interesting piece of evidence that supports this as well. So the invasion started on the 24th, but on February 27th, the Russian government accidentally allowed an auto-published article that had been pre-written to be published on its state website. And this article, this statement was specifically talking about, it was written in the context of they had won the war, displaced Zelensky or killed him, and had taken control of Kyiv. And the statement more or less congratulated Ukraine and Belarus on rejoining Russia in a partnership and ensuring that all of the same people were once again united under a strong central government. So we do know that that is a massive intention. Now, whether or not that will also involve genocide against Ukrainians, that's another question. It's difficult to say because, of course, in a perfect world, I should specify, in Putin's idea of a perfect world, Ukrainians would all become very loyal Russian citizens right away. Since that's unlikely to happen, we likely would see extremely harsh punishments, potentially concentration camp style, for people who insisted on a free Ukraine and who continued to protest. I see we have another question. Someone said, "Thank you, Rebecca, for such a great presentation." Thank you. What do you recommend for trustworthy news sources? I think when it comes to trustworthy news sources, number one, you want to make sure that you are consulting multiple large names. That doesn't mean that the only good news is the news that's coming from like CNN, for example, or the New York Times. However, it can be easier to kind of suss out what is legitimate and what's a little bit more fringe news, so to speak, by examining and cross-examining what people who have trained journalists on the ground in Ukraine are saying and whether or not their experiences line up. So I would say utilize several large international news, BBC, New York Times, Fox News, CNN, they all have people on the ground right now, so they're good to kind of cross-examine. If you have access to Ukrainian news sources, unfortunately, Google Translate for Ukrainian is just absolutely awful. However, because Russian is also common in Ukraine, the Google Translate from Russian to English is actually quite good. So if you can find Ukrainian newspapers that are written in Russian, you can then use Google Translate on those and get a pretty good idea of what they're updating on. Another question, what other possible sanctions could be leveled against Russia to make an effective impact? It's very difficult to say. I think one of the problems is that countries are scared to make too effective an impact and prompt any really drastic response from the Russian government. What I think would be effective would be closing the sky over Ukraine. That's one of the requests that have been made. In other words, it would be NATO enforcing a no-fly zone, and that would include the ability to drop missiles and to continue shelling Ukrainian cities. Putin has repeatedly threatened that if NATO were to do this, it would escalate the war. However, I think, to be absolutely frank, that we're already looking at an escalation of the war, and that this is a very rare opportunity where Ukraine has kind of single-handedly managed to fend off the worst of the attacks, the worst that has been planned for them. I think that it would be politically more savvy to take advantage of that momentum and to take action now than to wait until it's already spread across borders, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and then kind of try to backtrack. So that's something that I think would make an effective impact. It's not really an economic sanction, it's more of like a military sanction. It's the only example that I can give and have any confidence that it would make a severe, like a significant difference.
We have a question here in Pembroke. I'm going to have the person come up and ask.
There have been reports that Ukrainian citizens have been forced to go to Russia, been taken by force from cities and forced to sign papers saying that they've gone willingly. Is that a credible report?
That's a great question. I've actually been asked that several times in the last few days. It's difficult to answer with any certainty because Ukrainian citizens who are currently in, for lack of a better term, possession of Russia, it is virtually impossible to determine whether it was consensual or not, because obviously under control of the Russian military and the Russian government, any paper signed saying that it was willing doesn't mean that it was willing. In fact, I would say there are very likely to be populations of people who identify ethnically as Russian, who speak Russian as a language, who have fled into Russia willingly and legitimately because that was where they preferred to stay. There were legitimate and are legitimate separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk who would rather be a part of Russia. As far as people being forced, I think it's likely. I cannot 100% say that these reports are true or not. However, for Russia capturing Ukrainian citizens, whether making it seem consensual or not consensual would still, it would be a show of power, for lack of a better term, and it would be an opportunity for Russia to tell Russians via state media what a great job they're doing and how so many Ukrainians are choosing them instead. So we got another question. How did Canada acquire a 1.4 million Ukrainian diaspora? There's a few different answers to that. Number one, there is a huge Ukrainian diaspora period, and a lot of that has to do with several of the events that I've discussed. So even starting with Holodomor, those who could leave, which was not a very large percentage, but those who could leave did. Same thing with the Orange Revolution, same thing with Maidan. As the conflict has escalated over time, populations of Ukrainians have left. There are many who are involved in the Ukrainian diaspora who were not born in Ukraine, who were born here. However, Ukraine has kind of an exceptional sense of national pride. So many of them are still raised speaking Ukrainian at home, for example, and taught to identify as Ukrainian. There have been immigration protocols specifically for Ukrainians, both in the US and in Canada, as well as other European countries. So that has also partially contributed to it. And the reason Canada specifically, part of that, to be honest, is because Canada has more lenient, I would say, immigration opportunities than the United States does. And two, because for many populations across the world, the United States is actually no longer the ideal destination to immigrate to. For many of them, it's Canada. They see Canada as a more lenient, a more forgiving, a more diverse, and a more politically free alternative to the United States. So a lot of them probably intentionally chose Canada. Another one, Rebecca, do you see more foreign fighters entering the war from both sides in the coming weeks and months? I do. So there are pretty consistent reports of, for example, soldiers from the UK, soldiers from the US, veterans, for example, who are going into Ukraine. I do think that that is going to continue because I think that there is a huge sense of empathy kind of around the world. I think a lot of people are impressed by President Zelensky. A lot of people are horrified by what's going on. And I also think, honestly, just in a Cold War vacuum, the general fear of and hatred of Russia has never really disappeared. It just kind of became more latent. And so a lot of people are seeing this as an opportunity to go to the front lines and to fight against a famous historic aggressor. So I do see that continuing. As far as from the Russian side, what I think we are going to see, this information comes partially from an anonymous KGB member who wrote up a series of documents and released them. They were then translated into English, but also just from a political analysis perspective. We are very likely to see mercenaries from Syria who have been hired by the Russian government, but who are told to pose as volunteer soldiers entering into Ukraine to fight on the Russian side as the Russian military kind of wanes. And as it becomes clear that those who are there, a lot of them are very unmotivated. Some are choosing to leave, and already the huge majority of what Putin had kind of designated as the force that was supposed to take over Ukraine is already in Ukraine. So I do think that we will see Syrians entering. I don't think that we're going to see a whole lot of volunteer soldiers who are entering from the side of Russia.
Rebecca, we have a raised hand
Yes.
from Jean. Jean, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes. My source of news is PBS, Public Broadcasting Company. And tonight on the news, they had President Zelensky talking about backing off on the pursuit of joining NATO and using that as a possible bargaining point with Russia. And I wondered, I understand better now why NATO, can't pursue it after your explanation right now. But it seems to me like that would be a really important point to put in the bargaining pot with Putin.
Yeah, for sure. This is being very hotly debated right now, kind of across Europe and also across Ukrainian supporters. So there are a lot of different narratives that are going around surrounding the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO. I apologize for any thumping you may hear in the background. One of my cats is locked away and he is not happy about it all of a sudden. But so one of the narratives going around is that Russia shouldn't have the ability to dictate what Ukraine can and cannot do politically, what they can join. This has been a crux of the discussion surrounding Russia and Ukraine's relationship for a long time now, and it's partially what led to Euromaidan, the 2013-2014 protests, where they ousted the Russian favoring president. Another side of it is pointing out that one of the reasons that this war occurred is because Ukraine refused to back off on joining NATO and the EU. And so there are those who have the opinion that for them to concede now, when they could have done it prior to the beginning of the war, would in a sense not only be capitulating to Russia in a way that would set their relationship kind of on a worse course. It would put Ukraine back at a disadvantage, but it would also waste, so to speak, those in Ukraine who have died already. So with that said, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. If I were Zelensky, I would also be very seriously considering what can I give up to make this stop happening. I don't know whether or not we are going to see a legitimate negotiated solution. Part of that is because I don't think that that would be the only concession that Putin would accept. I think he would go much, much farther and much harder, since at this point, his opinion is probably that he doesn't have a whole lot to lose. He's already losing the war anyway, so he may as well push for as much as he can get in a negotiation. So those are just a few of, I think, kind of the arguments that are going around. My personal opinion is that if that is the outcome, it's just creating a latent conflict, and that this would happen again at some point in the future, which doesn't mean that it's the wrong decision now, to avoid any further bloodshed now and give them more time to kind of prepare and bolster weaponry. But I also can't confidently say that it would be the right solution either. To be fair, I don't know that there is a right or wrong solution at this point when you're talking about how many more citizens will die in Mariupol tomorrow if they don't, versus how many 20 years from now if this continues. Does that answer your question? I see other questions. Are there any EU or NATO countries who haven't been as supportive of Ukraine? Right now, I would say that Europe is pretty well united, at least verbally, in their support of Ukraine. I would argue that in terms of actions, many of them are not nearly as supportive as they would have the international community believe that they are. So, for example, there are countries that outwardly claim, obviously, that they support Ukraine. However, they're not sending very much aid. They are not super readily or willingly taking in Ukrainian refugees, for example, or they're staying kind of unreasonably silent about it. Additionally, I think that if the EU and NATO had been as supportive of Ukraine historically as they claim to be, that this conflict probably would have been avoided by Ukraine secretly and spontaneously joining the EU and NATO. So if there had been successful secret negotiations to have Ukraine join both of those, then Putin would never have been able to invade to intentionally prevent that from happening, because it would just have suddenly happened. It would have been announced in the news, and invading Ukraine would suddenly have been the equivalent of invading the EU. And the fact that that didn't happen, even though politically it was an option, everything is always an option, suggests to me that while they do support Ukraine, most of them do not support Ukraine over their own self-preservation and own sense of well-being. This isn't uncommon, and from some perspectives, it can be a little bit difficult to fault them for that. However, at the same time, the entire purpose of NATO being created was to prevent this exact scenario. And so the fact that this scenario is now on Europe's doorstep and NATO is not being utilized also suggests to me that what words are being shared and what aid is being poured into Ukraine is not genuinely as supportive as they would want the rest of the world to believe. Another question, Xi Jinping has been relatively quiet in Western media. What position do you think China will take if the war persists? This is a very interesting question, and I think that there are a few factors in this. So a lot of people see China and Russia as being on one side, the same side. In some ways, this is not incorrect. However, there are some kind of important distinctions here. So one of them is that it's been 15, 20 years now that Russia has been trying to pressure China into a negotiated agreement regarding the importation and exportation of oil. So Russia wants to lock China into an exclusive agreement with them regarding oil sales, and China consistently and repeatedly refuses and resists. So this has been a point of contention, economic contention between the two governments for nearly 2 decades now. Another thing to note is that there actually is territory that is contested between China and Russia. So there are mountainous regions that Russia claims is Russia and China claims is China, and neither of them have been willing to concede thus far. So that's also kind of a contentious ground. What position China will take, I think it will do its absolute best to remain neutral, to avoid being economically hit if it were to side with Russia and the United States were to take similar sanctions, although even that is slightly less likely because the US economy is intertwined with the Chinese economy in such a way that it would be much, much more difficult to put effective sanctions on China the way that they've been placed on Russia. In general, I mean, if we're going to talk about an absolute 100% scenario, would China choose the US or would China choose Russia? China probably would choose Russia, but I don't think we're going to see a scenario like that. If anything, I think China is very likely trying to calculate right now, not only what the outcome is going to be, but how they can benefit from it and how they could benefit from an ongoing conflict if the conflict continues. People have brought up Taiwan recently and whether or not China is going to try to take over Taiwan while the world is kind of distracted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think it's possible, but only if the war were to continue on for a very long while. Otherwise, it would be a bit too risky. And I hope that answered your question. I know that might be a little bit vague, but I think with China, that's kind of a political reality, is that they're vague. A comment from an attendee in response to Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. This goes back to the late 19th century and a large migration of Ukrainians from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. During World War I, a Canadian decision to intern Austro-Hungarian citizens resulted in mostly ethnic Ukrainians being interned until 1921. An excellent little miniature history lesson. Thank you.
Rebecca, I have a question unrelated to Ukraine.
Yeah.
You have 3 master's degrees. Are you going to go for a 4th or a PhD?
I am planning on going for a PhD at some point, probably a combined PhD law program at some point. I'm not really sure when. Right now, I quite like where I'm at. And although that is definitely a goal in my future, and I am very much an advocate of continuing education where it's accessible and where you're able. Yeah, I'm not sure when that's going to happen, but I do know that I want to continue to be involved with this part of the world. I think that politically it's very important right now. I also think just even from a humane perspective, which is the perspective that I tend to take on, ensuring healthy outcomes for as many people as possible, not just Ukrainians, but also Russians who are currently being oppressed by the Russian government, is a huge focal point for my future.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? I'll take that as a no. Well, thank you, Rebecca. We appreciate it. We're getting thumbs up from some of the attendees, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.